You see, Doctor, God didn't make that movie. Fate didn't butcher it, and destiny didn't feed it to the fanboys. If God saw what was done that night, he didn't seem to mind. From then on, I knew God didn't make the Watchmen movie this way. Zack Snyder did.
Comic book writer Alan Moore first conceived of what would eventually become Watchmen shortly after DC Comics acquired the rights to a collection of heroes previously published under the defunct Charlton Comics. He wanted to revamp and reimagine the characters before taking them into a dark, new direction. He'd actually done this a few years earlier with Miracle Man, a character originally published under Fawcett Comics. He pitched his concept to DC chief Dick Giordano, who liked the story, but realized quickly that what Moore was planning to do would render the newly acquired characters virtually unusable in future projects, and DC hadn't bought the rights to these things just to burn the characters off in one story. So he convinced Moore to create new characters, most of whom were thinly veiled pastiches that devoted comic fans would see through anyway. Dave Gibbons was brought in for the artwork, having worked with Moore before on, among other things, the legendary Superman story For the Man Who Has Everything. The first issue of Watchmen landed in September 1986 and was concluded in 12 issues, shaking the comic book world to its core in the process with its dark, dystopian world on the brink of destruction, its amoral and broken characters who had little to no right to be called heroes, and its complete deconstruction of the entire superhero genre, ushering in what is now thought of as the Dark Age of comics. Now, truth is that's actually a bit of an oversimplification. The so-called Bronze Age of comics had already been taking things in a more dark and consequences-driven direction since the start of the 70s. The groundwork had been laid at DC with stories like that one where Green Arrow's sidekick becomes a drug addict. Meanwhile, over at Marvel, there were stories like the death of Gwen Stacy and Chris Claremont's work with the X-Men, with things like the Dark Phoenix saga and God Loves, Man Kills. But 1985 still feels like a good year to draw the line at for the end of the Bronze Age, because in 1986, you had not only Watchmen, but you also had Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns earlier that same year. Now, people will usually point to Watchmen first because it wasn't written by an out and proud xenophobe who seems to have since lost his understanding of heroes altogether. So let that be your main lesson today, kids. It's less embarrassing to be an anarchist than a racist. We're not really here to talk about that. We're here to talk about that time in 2009 when Zack Snyder made it into a movie. A movie that has caused some of the most heated movie-based arguments I've ever gotten into. First, upon its initial release, they were arguments with people who said that it totally works, actually. And then in years since, the argument has been with people who disagree with me about why it doesn't work. Because I've seen a ton of think pieces and breakdowns that pick over every single tiny detail that was changed, altered, or omitted, whether it be John going to retrieve his own watch instead of getting one that he fixed for Janie, or inserting Janie into the TV interview confrontation, or Dan not having a gut, as if a catalog of such things might reveal the exact missing piece that brought it all down. There are some more sophisticated analyses out there that might point to potential misunderstanding of certain elements by Snyder and his team, with Rorschach coming off as cool when he should be repulsive, and action scenes that are thrilling when they should be off-putting and uncomfortable. But while I don't think any of those things are not issues, and they certainly don't help, none of this is the true heart of the problem with this movie. Because even if these changes, additions, omissions were reversed, the film still wouldn't work. Because it's not what Snyder changed that doomed the film, it's what he didn't. The 2009 film version of Watchmen is too loyal to the source material in a way that I, for one, have always found fascinating. So let's talk about it. Just a quick note, because I know it's going to get brought up if I don't address it. I've now seen 3 different cuts of this movie: theatrical, director's, and ultimate. I really shouldn't have had to do that, because when my argument is it's too loyal to the original, that's not an argument that's going to be diminished by putting in even more stuff from the comic. But I did it anyway, so that nobody can tell me that if I'd watched a different cut of the movie, I'd be saying something else. And also, for the record, as I anticipated, each successive cut made the issues I'm focusing on worse. And I'm even going to pull some examples from them, so there you go. With that out of the way, let me kind of jump to the end and explain that the core of what I'm going to be talking about is really the differences in artistic mediums. Every form of media has certain things that it doesn't do very well, or indeed things that it doesn't do at all. A novel doesn't have images. A comic book doesn't have sound. A film doesn't have interactivity. And a video game, while you can do many things with it, it doesn't allow for a passive experience. Additionally, some mediums have tricks unique to them, or at least absent from most other forms of media. There are aspects of live theater that can't be recreated without the interactions between performer and audience. The freedom of a novel reader to envision the world and the characters as they see without having the visuals dictated to them doesn't exist in film or television or comics. The interactive nature of video games offers whole new worlds of experiences. When it comes to adapting any given piece of work from one medium to another, there are any number of things that are going to make that difficult, but to my way of thinking, the big one is as follows. How precisely was the work tailored to its original medium? Because the more a piece of work takes advantage of the unique traits of the medium it was originally told in, the harder it's going to be to adapt it to a medium that doesn't have those same traits. My shorthand example of this is the film adaptation of the stage musical Into the Woods. You may not have seen it, doesn't matter because I'm going to explain anyway. Reviews on that film were mixed for a variety of reasons, but among the most consistent criticisms was a jarring tone shift that hits a little more than halfway into the film. That shift is in the play too, but it works there because it's built around something currently unique to live theater: the intermission. So just in case you're not familiar with the show or the movie, it plays around with a bunch of fairy tale characters and plots, and the end of the first act, everything seems to have been tied up in a rather neat little bow. There's a big happily ever after song. The lights come up, you stretch, you use the bathroom, and probably about halfway through the intermission, the thought hits you. Hey, that really did feel like an ending. What the heck is going to happen in the second act? That time during which the story stops gives your brain a chance to catch up, reset, and then prepare for the other shoe to drop. You may not know exactly what's coming, but you had the intermission to realize that something was coming. So when it does, you're better prepared to roll with it. But a film has no intermission. It just steamrolls right through the tone shift, and it results in complete emotional whiplash for any viewer who didn't know in advance that that was going to happen. The stage version took advantage of something unique to theater, and the film failed to account for that and just adapted it straight to a new medium that doesn't work the same way. This is actually also the same reason why a lot of Lovecraft adaptations don't work. In a novel, you can actually get away with vague imagery and calling the rest indescribable. In a film, you have to show it. And that undermines the whole idea of incomprehensibility. And that idea is at the heart of most of Lovecraft's work. Well, that and the racism, but we'll move on from that. But this is the kind of thing that we're going to be looking at as I talk about the Watchmen film. Because Alan Moore is a very particular kind of writer. Most comic book writers, assuming they aren't also the artists, when they script for a company like DC, they will detail the events, the characters, obviously the dialogue, and what they consider to be the most important specifics. After that, usually a great deal will be left up to the artist when it comes to things like background details, specifics of the character poses, sometimes even the panel layout. Alan Moore does not write like that. He details everything that he wants to see on a panel, right down to the slogan on a coffee mug. He's an extremely exacting writer, and nothing appears in the Watchmen comics that wasn't put there with purpose by him. That's not to downplay the contributions of artist Dave Gibbons, only to say that he was working within very exacting specifications given to him by Moore. Alan Moore is exactly the kind of writer who is going to create something tailored to the last detail for the medium of comic books. Now, it's easy enough for me to say that. Maybe I should give you some specific examples. The big one is actually the panel layout. Watchmen's pages are laid out in a 9-panel, 3x3 grid. On occasion, where an image needs to make more impact, it might take up 2 or even 3 of, say, the bottom panels, or maybe 1 or even 2 out of 3 of the vertical columns, but the layout is still always identifiable as the same 3x3 setup. This creates a rhythm for the reader, a consistent pace. It's like the ticking of a metronome, interrupted by select doses of holding a beat for a few panels longer than usual to draw attention. Snyder appears to have decided that the film equivalent to taking up a couple more panels is to go into slow motion, which on paper is logical, but the effect is actually quite different. The thing about giving more panel space to an image is that it does absolutely draw more attention to that, but it also doesn't demand that you spend any longer looking at it than you would at a standard panel. It emphasizes without actually slowing down. But slow motion, well, slowing down is all that it does. So while it may bring emphasis to these same moments, it does so in a way that kills the rhythm, which doesn't happen on the comic book page. What the comic is able to do is bring special attention to a scene or a character organically with minimal breaking of flow. That is, until the book deliberately decides to break that flow in the last chapter. The final issue of this comic opens with 6 successive splash pages. That's comic book lingo for a full-page image, depicting death and destruction in New York. The comfort of the grid is gone. There is literally nothing for you to look at beside the horror of the scene, and the first 2 page turns will bring you no respite. There is no possible way to miss the impact of this because of how it shatters the orderly and economic presentation of the comic up to that point. And film doesn't really have a technique to match that. Yes, you can slow the scene down. Yes, you can pipe in dramatic music. Yes, you can have a longer continuous shot. But for it to truly have the same impact as these pages in terms of breaking its own format, the film would have had to have had no slow motion and no musical score up until that point. Otherwise, it's just not the same. It's not as jarring. It can't be. The medium doesn't allow for it, and it was written to take very specific advantage of the comic book format, and the entire story is tailored to maximize that moment. Okay, so Moore writes for his medium. So what? So does any creator worth their salt. But it's more than just some of the specifics that I've started laying out. It's also about the pace at which the story is even meant to be read. And I don't mean panel to panel or page to page pacing. I touched on that already. This time, I mean the pacing from issue to issue. Watchmen is a deliberately dense piece of work. Every element in every panel on every page is there deliberately, and it has purpose and meaning. And to be blunt, it's meant to be taken in slowly, one issue at a time. For anyone who hasn't read the comic and just picks up the trade paperback, I always advise that they not burn through that thing as fast as they can. You need to take no more than one issue a night. I actually tend to advise people taking more time than that between issues, because Moore didn't make it this dense to be pretentious. He did it because there was going to be a full month between each issue. And he wanted the reader to be revisiting and thinking about the previous issue and the ones that came before in that time, poring over the details, better understanding the world. The gap is part of the intended experience. That's part of the purpose of things like the Tales of the Black Freighter. It glides along as an odd detail on first reading. A little strange, but when it's first introduced, it's not flow-breaking because it crops up as one, maybe two panels on the grid of 9. But going back and lingering on the odd details while you're waiting for the next issue is where you'll start to understand why it's there. And that will help you understand its relevance ahead of when it starts taking up entire pages. Readers are meant to absorb it and grapple with it gradually before moving on to the next issue. And I honestly think that's part of why the HBO Watchmen TV series works. It does its best to achieve a density comparable to the original work. It's not quite at the same level, but the fact that episodes come out one per week is part of why it's able to get away with it. Binging the Watchmen TV show would be doing it a disservice, just like binging the issues would be doing a disservice to the comics. And there's another thing you can do in a comic that you can't do with film, television, or even a prose novel. And that is linger on a page and stay in the moment. When you're watching a movie, the only way to take in the story is to allow it to continue playing, to keep pulling you forward through the narrative. Sure, if you're watching at home, you can pause, but that just gives you a solitary frame to look at out of 24 frames per second. Similarly, if you're reading a book, you can reread a page or even a chapter, but you have to be moving forward. Your eyes have to be moving forward across the words to get anything. If you stop reading, the storytelling stops as well. You can't just look at a page of prose and soak it in the way you can with the page of a comic. In these other mediums, you can't linger. But with a comic, if you want to stay on a page, it doesn't fully stop your experience. It allows you to just take in more of what's in front of you, and then you make the decision to move forward. You have agency in determining the pacing. Not sole agency. There are multiple ways for writers and artists to guide you at the pace that they want, like what I talked about with the panel layouts. But it's still more than you'll have in other mediums. In film or TV or prose, you're either moving forward through the story or you're not taking part at all. Comics let you pause without disengaging. Video games are really the only other narrative medium I can think of that allows for this, as in some games you can explore and linger in an environment or a setting before deciding to move the story forward. But that's something that the developers of a video game have to allow for. With comics, it's intrinsic to the medium. Why does this matter? Well, let's go to the issue of the Black Freighter. As I mentioned, in the comics, these digressions start out only a couple of panels on a handful of pages. A reader could linger on these and think on the meaning behind their inclusion, or they could glide right past, give them little to no thought. At first, at least. Because there's buildup, and eventually it demands more attention over time, because by the end, the Black Freighter's taking up entire pages. It escalates, going from a scant few panels to the entire page. And in the ultimate cut of Watchmen, there's an animated adaptation of Tales from the Black Freighter spliced into the film, and it forces the entire rest of the movie to stop dead right from the very first segment. As a viewer, you no longer have a choice as to whether this is something worth paying attention to. With the film, you are literally deprived of anything else to focus on while it gives you a Black Freighter segment. In the comic, the initial injection of those segments is small, almost missable, and it evolves over the issues until it demands your full attention by taking up the entire page. It starts as a gentle poke and grows louder until you cannot ignore it anymore. But on film, the first injection of Black Freighter material is just as jarring as the last, because every single time it demands the same amount of attention, i.e., all of it. It doesn't escalate in significance. It can't, because the medium of film doesn't have an equivalent way to drip feed it from single panels on a grid to full comic book pages. The film forces the flow breakage in a way that commands attention right from the start, removing the ability to give it more and more focus, which is a major element of its existence in the original work. Now look, it's honestly possible that the entire Black Freighter segment of the original is given more time than it needs. I've seen the issue argued in both directions. But there is no question that the way the film has to present something like this breaks the entire narrative flow over its knee and makes the viewers watch. Additionally, the way in which the original story is broken up by issues allows it to pivot in a way that does not translate very well to a continuous medium like film. Because there's a clean break with each new issue. It isn't jarring or pace-killing to have an entire issue dedicated to the comedian's backstory, or Rorschach's mental state, or Dr. Manhattan's origin. Much like the chapter breaks in a novel, issue breaks provide a natural stopping point, and if you have that, you can pivot the timeline, the character focus, the point of view. It's just like my first example with Into the Woods, using the intermission as a stopping point to pivot its story. But film is a continual experience. As I noted before, it demands forward momentum. Stopping any forward momentum of the plot to do what feels like a 20-minute sidebar goes against the continuous nature of watching a film, because a film doesn't have natural stopping points to do that with. Film doesn't have clean breaks like intermissions, chapters, or separated issues to segment the story and allow for something to be more sectioned off without feeling intrusive or tangential, which is how they end up coming across in the movie. There are some ways to try and make these divergences work better on film, but Snyder just took the way that Moore did it in the comic and left it as is, and it simply wasn't designed to work this way. In the case of a piece like Watchmen, the issues of adaptation go beyond just the story itself. The original work was a commentary on the superhero genre in comics at the time it was made. It was commenting on itself. It existed in a specific context that just wasn't the case for the film version, especially not in 2009. And as a reminder, at the time the movie came out, there were only 2 films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We'd only gotten the second Nolan Batman film a year before. In other words, superheroes were not yet the biggest thing in the medium of film. When Moore wrote Watchmen, superheroes were practically the only game in town in the medium of comic books. Subgenres like horror, western, romances had become extremely niche, had to go independent, or had vanished altogether. By and large, if you bought a comic, it meant you were reading about superheroes. That is the artistic world that Watchmen existed in and was commenting on. A Watchmen film would honestly have a lot more validity being released right now, when superheroes pretty much are the biggest thing going on in film and have been for a little while. That's part of why the Amazon series The Boys is doing so well. And no, I still haven't seen The Boys. I have no interest in the source material, and even though I've heard good things about how it was adapted, I just haven't had the time. But my point is that with superheroes being ubiquitous in more and more entertainment mediums, now is the time for works like The Boys or Watchmen. But that wasn't the world that the Watchmen film was released into. Now, one might conceivably, therefore, argue that that just means it's gained more significance since then, and the film was actually ahead of its time. And that's an interesting notion, but sadly, I have to say no, that's not the case. Because it's not commenting on the world of superhero films in the 2010s and beyond, any more than it was commenting on the superhero films of the 2000s when it came out originally. Because of how closely Watchmen the film sticks to the original work, it's a 2009 film that's commenting on the comic book world of 1986. And some of the specifics of the things that went on in the Watchmen comics were big deals because of the state of the medium at the time. Take, for instance, the sex scenes between Silk Spectre and Night Owl. At that point in comics, sex was still pretty taboo as a topic, especially in mainstream comics. The very existence of scenes like this in a comic was unexpected and off-putting, because this was the kind of thing that genuinely felt like you shouldn't be reading it. And that's without getting into some of the specifics, like Dan's erectile dysfunction. In a superhero comic book? What? Superheroes didn't have sex on panel in 1986? By contrast, sex scenes in films, even big-budget mainstream ones, haven't been taboo for decades. So when those same scenes show up in a film, it's not breaking any new ground for the medium. It's not even that unexpected. The same scene, played the same way, in a medium where sex scenes are standard practice, loses the significance it had in its original form, and suddenly you're wondering, why is that even there? I feel at this point it's worth actually going over a little bit of history and noting that Snyder was not the first director to try and get this movie made. The film rights actually got purchased before the comic was even finished its run. Those rights bounced around numerous studios over about a 2-decade span. Terry Gilliam was attached for a while, but eventually he left because he came to the conclusion that nothing less than a 5 to 6 hour miniseries was going to do the original justice. He declared it unfilmable. Now, following the success of the first X-Men film in 2000, screenwriter David Hayter worked on it at Universal with hopes to direct. He eventually left over creative differences, but his script fell into the hands of a few more directors after that, including Darren Aronofsky and Paul Greengrass. That was before ultimately landing in the lap of Zack Snyder. At that point, Alex Say, whose career had mostly been script doctoring up to that point, came in to shape the script into what Snyder wanted to do with it. This revision actually brought the script more in line with the comic, as, among other things, Hayter's draft had brought the timeline up to date so that the film would be contemporary. This entire element got scrapped in order to make it a period piece set in the 1980s, which only served to emphasize that it was commenting on the past and not the present, which is another point the HBO series successfully absorbed. So did the adaptation of Moore's V for Vendetta, come to think of it. It's been well documented at this point that Snyder appears to have used the comic panels as storyboards for the film, mimicking the images rather than adapting them. And to be fair, this had worked for him once before when he adapted Frank Miller's 300. But there's just the simple fact that 300 is not Watchmen. And I don't mean that to be derogatory, but it's just not doing anything close to the same thing. The entirety of 300 is double-page spreads, which means visually it already is in an aspect ratio more akin to a movie screen, and the pacing of 300 is far closer to that of a film than a traditional comic anyways. It wasn't a thoughtful, meditative piece on the psychology of its characters. It was a propellant thrill ride. And that doesn't inherently make it a worse comic, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. What that makes it is a much cleaner fit for film than Watchmen would ever be. What worked for 300 would not work here. Now finally, to try and drive home my main point, I want to illustrate two specific things that the film version of Watchmen did that actually reflect thoughtful adaptation, as a way to contrast with the film's failure to do it pretty much anywhere else. Firstly, ditching the squib was a good idea. I know purists got up in arms over this, but it was the right call to make, especially at the time. Taking the film on its own merits, the things that it would have had to have done to get audiences to go along with the whole concept of an interdimensional squid it was simply not worth the effort. And don't forget the context that I already mentioned about when this film was released. We were still in the grounded, realistic phase of superhero movies. We were 2 years away from Thor starting to introduce more outright fantastical elements into comic book and superhero movies, and we were a full 5 years away from Guardians of the Galaxy proving that it was actually safe to go completely bonkers.
Oh, yeah.
Part of why the squid works in the comic is that interdimensional monsters were standard for the genre at the time, but that was not the case for superheroes on film in 2009, and trying to go there would have lost most of the audience who weren't expecting it. The HBO series gets away with referencing the squid, but that's because it came out at a point when audiences have gotten used to that level of insanity in superhero shows and movies. But back in 2009, tying the destruction of New York to Dr. Manhattan was cleaner, and it kept the end result intact. It accounts for what the comic was able to get away with that the film would not have been able to. And then there's the one part of the entire movie where Zack Snyder truly took advantage of what film can do that comics can't, and that is the opening credit montage. The interplay of music and image, the choice of song, the pace of it, how it establishes the alternate world in which the story takes place. It's all done in a way that takes maximum advantage of what can be done with film that couldn't be done in a comic. In the comic book, the information that gets delivered in this montage is interwoven and interspersed as small details dropped in as little side things in a scene or in a little bit of dialogue in passing. Now, the lazy way to do this and establish it in a film would have been with a text crawl or a voiceover at the start of the film. But instead, Snyder makes use of the interplay of image and sound at the disposal of a filmmaker to provide the same vital details in a way unique to the movie. It's amazing. It's easily the best part of the entire film, and it reflects the most thoughtful piece of adaptation the thing has to offer. But it's only used to set up the world as efficiently as possible, and being efficient means you absolutely have to take advantage of your medium. And then after that, it settles into just retelling the comic in a format that it wasn't meant to be told in. It's a tiny glimpse of the possibilities of what a properly adapted Watchmen movie might have been. Or maybe it's actually a glimpse into why this project was doomed from inception. Watchmen is so specifically tailored to comics, not only the comic book format, but the world of comics at the time it was written, that to do everything necessary to properly fit that story into the medium of film and to say about film superheroes what the original said about comic book superheroes, that might honestly have required so many changes that we would have been left wondering, is this even still Watchmen? I brought up the HBO series a few times already, and the single smartest thing that show did was not adapt the original work. Instead, it did a follow-up story set in the present timeline of the world that the Watchmen comic book had depicted. And that new story is specifically tailored to the television format that it's being told in. It's able to evoke the original Watchmen. It can play out the consequences from that story. It can bring in new elements, all without risking screwing it up in translation. Or as Snyder's film did, failing to translate it very much at all. Loyalty to the original work is important in any adaptation, but it's not the only thing that will make or break the end product. If you don't tailor the work for the new medium properly, then you haven't really adapted it. You've just retold it in a way that it wasn't meant to be told. You've taken a story out of its element and made it less effective as a result. And the more that story took advantage of its original format, the more glaring this issue is going to be. And that, the strict adherence to the original text, is the ultimate failing of Zack Snyder's Watchmen. A noble failing, perhaps, rooted in a desire to honor the original, most certainly, but a failing, nonetheless.
Heard joke once. Man goes to doctor. Says he's depressed. says life seems harsh and cruel. Doctor says treatment is simple. The great film director Zack Snyder is in town tonight. Go and see him. You'll embrace the darkness. Man bursts into tears, says, "But doctor, I am Zack Snyder." Good joke. Everybody laugh. Roll on snare drum. Curtains.
So that's Watchmen. And my reasons why I think the movie doesn't work. Like I said, mine's not the only take out there. I've seen some terrific breakdowns as to some of the problems with this that are more rooted in the changes that were made and indication of Snyder's misunderstanding of some of the characters. I've seen that brought up by YouTubers like Movie Bob or Maggie Mae Fish. Feel free to check out their videos on Snyder as a filmmaker for a more insight on that. But this has always been what's bugged me about the Watchmen movie. It adhered too close to the original for it to ever work. And I felt like nobody ever brought that up whenever they talked about why the movie failed, if they thought it failed. If you like the movie, that's great. But I don't know anyone who doesn't consider it the lesser version of the story. And that need not be the case for adaptation. Some people seem to take it as a given. Well, like, of course the original's better. Like, it's not always, though. It doesn't have to be the lesser version of the exact same thing. And that's why I refuse to accept that absolute loyalty is a good thing. So there you go, folks. Thanks for going through this journey with me. This one took a lot of time. And it took a lot of work. And I've been thinking about it for a long time. It's probably going to be a little while before I do something this big again. I need to focus on getting the novel out. And also, honestly, I could use a minor breather. That doesn't mean there's going to be fewer videos. It'll still be 2 a week. That'll stay. But like, I'm not doing something this big for a little bit. I got to catch up on some stuff. If you want to help me out and keep this whole thing going, I got a Patreon. But even if you're not able to support me financially, like, share, subscribe, all those things help as well. Whatever you thought about what I said, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. But you also don't have to, because at the end of the day, you're the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.